What are some of the common mental health conditions that Canadians are suffering from today?
Well, the vast majority would be depression, anxiety, bipolar, and schizophrenia. Those are the primary ones. Depression, anxiety, and bipolar are the mood disorders. I had a mood disorder clinic for about 25 years, so that's where my area of expertise is. And most of the people who were referred to me by their GPs were labeled treatment resistant. So they were the people who they had sort of given up on medicines, and I was sort of their last resort.
Mm-hmm. And as a doctor in practice now, and you're working closely with so many Canadians who are struggling with mental health issues, how do you feel about this transition where MAID is being opened up to those with mental illness, and yet those who serve in mental health fields are fighting to stop people from ending their lives by suicide, and yet now it's being opened to for Canadians to receive medically assisted suicide? What do you think about that?
Well, it's incredibly confusing and surprising. I mean, we've just opened up a national suicide prevention hotline. I think it's 988 for national suicide prevention. And then on the other hand, we're broadening medical assistance in dying for the exact same reason that people are calling 988. Like the contrast is like astonishing. We're trying to help them, but yet we're giving, but here's your other option. So I'm incredulous that this is happening. Also too, in mental health, we can never, because there's no objective tests in mental health, so we can't do an X-ray and say, look, it's just too advanced, that now it's terminal. In mental health is never like that. So in mental health, at least in my experience, we could help everybody. Like, we could always help something. And most of the people who came to see me who were treatment resistant, we just adjusted their medicines and they made a really good recovery. And their suffering diminished dramatically or even made a full recovery. So I find in mental health, it's impossible to say you cannot recover. All we can say is, well, the treatments haven't worked very well up to this point. Also too, remember, depression, by my definition, is the absence of hope. Yeah. Well, so they're coming to us because I'm losing hope, and we know there's a medical condition causing that. Well, you don't then say, well, you have that symptom, so then you can end your life now. It's you have that symptom, so now you need to be treated. Mm-hmm. So you can't use the sense of hopelessness as an excuse for MAID when that's just a symptom of a treatable condition.
And just to speak to that, Laura, in fact, there are a number of professionals that are arguing that actually physicians might have an obligation to raise MAID, even if a patient hasn't requested it, and potentially even in the mental health context, if the patient might be eligible. The argument is that a patient should be informed of all treatment options. And once we say that MAID is healthcare, it becomes something that physicians will be expected to facilitate. And of course, that's a huge concern. If a patient who isn't even asking for medical assistance in dying has their clinician or physician offer it to them or raise it, what message does that send to them? You talk about hopelessness. I mean, how can that convey anything other than a message that their situation is hopeless? And so there's some real concerns there.
It's interesting, and so many Canadian medical associations and bodies, as well as hospitals, are speaking out against MAID for those who have mental illness. And that's very unique to our nation as well. We've got a lot of disagreement over this issue. Julia, we talk about safeguards, and of course, we're told that there are safeguards in place, and we can ensure someone who is not a vulnerable person doesn't fall into choosing MAID for mental illness. But Julia, tell us more about these safeguards and if they really can be trusted and used ethically.
Yeah, so I mean, the safeguards include things like you have to make a written request, it has to be signed by an independent witness, you need 2 independent doctors or nurse practitioners to do the assessment and to confirm eligibility. Under Track 2, one of them should have some expertise in your particular condition, and then there's a 90-day assessment period, which can be waived under certain circumstances. The one that I think is really important, I think there's this idea, including among parliamentarians, that MAID is going to be a very last resort for those patients with mental illness who have suffered for a very long period of time, where there's treatment futility, they've tried everything, nothing has worked. And it will only be that small group of people who are eligible. But that is not actually what the law says. The law doesn't even require treatment. It only requires that a patient be informed of the options available to them and that they've carefully considered it. So, and this, of course, like this is set to happen at a time when we know that far too many Canadians aren't even able to find care that is timely or affordable. So that is a real concern. And we've already seen, you know, with grievous and irremediable, who decides what is irremediable? And we've already seen how, I think it's fair to say the safeguards are not working in the system we have now. There are some practitioners who for sure are interpreting the criteria and the safeguards rigorously and doing the due diligence, but we have all heard so many stories where that is really not the case. And so to think of expanding this further on the basis of mental illness with all of those additional complexities of mental health is just, it's really disturbing.
Derek, you know, when we look at the landscape of Canada, we see that we are a front runner in medical assistance in dying. And so how do we compare to other jurisdictions of the world where MAID is being used?
Well, it's remarkable, as we just mentioned, it's only been 8 years that MAID has been implemented in Canada. And in that time, Canada has become one of the most permissive jurisdictions in the world. The rates have increased consistently since 2018. It's increased by 30% year over year, the number of Canadians who have died by MAID. 13,000 people in 2022 alone. Some of the things that set Canada apart, I think, are the fact that we do no longer have this requirement that someone's death be reasonably foreseeable. So in Oregon, for example, there's a requirement that a patient have a terminal diagnosis and that they have projected only 6 months left to live. There's no such restriction in Canada. And even if you look at jurisdictions that are more open, the Netherlands would be an example of one of the more open, permissive regimes. Even they arguably would have more strict criteria when it comes to mental illness, because there a doctor has to agree with a patient that there's no reasonable alternative to their situation. In Canada, the degree of suffering is really assessed based solely by the patient. And so if there's a situation where a patient's perception of their suffering is actually impacted by, for example, their mental disorder, how does one navigate that? And so the Canadian Council of Academies that studied this issue said that unless there are additional safeguards implemented, Canada would be essentially the most, or one of the, if not the most, permissive regimes in the world if they proceed with MAID for mental illness without some of these additional criteria.
To think that Canada would become a global frontrunner in the practice of MAID if recent expansions had gone through is heartbreaking and very disturbing. We know that euthanasia and the practice of MAID impacts families, and it will impact families across the nation if expansions occur. Recently, I sat down with Reverend Dr. Ephraim Radner at Wycliffe College at the University of Toronto, who shares his own experience with suicide in his family.
So, my mother killed herself when I was a teenager. And I realized, it took me a long time to realize this. You know, I'm 67, I'm still figuring some of this stuff out. Yeah. That probably by the time I was 10, she was already deeply depressed and acting in certain ways that were not life-affirming, let's put it that way, for herself. And she taught those to her children, not on purpose, but just by her struggles, and then finally by her death. And she made some attempts before, were unsuccessful, before she was successful. She taught us something. And I know she'd be aghast to think that she did what she did, but it happened. She taught us that it is possible to think of our lives as worthless at their root. I struggled with that for years. I made an attempt on my own life while I was at university with stuff that I know I learned. One of my sisters successfully killed herself 10 years later. Stuff she learned. There is no death that doesn't implicate a whole tree of people that literally ramifies, has branches.
Yeah.
John Donne famously says, no one is an island. And that is true, but it is true for the most negative things as for the most positive things. Yeah. Our responsibilities go everywhere. So a big question for Christians and for anybody is, what are we teaching one another when we both allow, let alone participate, let alone choose, in the deliberate ending of our lives? Yeah. What are we teaching people?
When you think about suffering, Dr. Radner, and I think about your own story, the experience of losing your mom and your sister, the emotional toll that took on you, and you mentioned that even to this day you're working through some of the issues that you inherited and were taught. You have lived a life where you have suffered as a result of other people's choices, and you continue to live that life. And here you are now, a voice to those who suffer, saying you can be resilient and move through this. Looking at the person of Jesus and the way he suffered on our behalf can really inspire us to be resilient in the face of our own suffering, physical, mental, emotional. Would you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I would say that's absolutely right. And I would say, even more than inspire Holy Spirit way, in an intimate, vivifying way. But we participate in his suffering. Paul talks about that, suffering with Jesus. Not necessarily in the sense of we're not redeeming the world, but we are actually allowing our suffering to be an offering that we make into his infinite treasury, which is his own love poured out for all the world and all of humankind, and for us as well. It's kind of response. And it's a response. How do we express love for someone? We give what's most important to us to them. Mm. And by offering, and I'll stick to that word as the main word I would use in terms of what we do with our suffering as Christians. We offer it. In Christ, we offer it to God. And I'm not sugarcoating it at all. I hope people realize that. But it can be a good gift. Yeah. And it goes so much against the grain of everything we teach people these days.